Adam is a colleague of mine here at the Economic Studies program at Brookings. He's a senior fellow here, and he's also, like me, affiliated with the Urban-Brookings Tax Policy Center. And Adam really has both the scholarly and practical expertise in tax policy to talk about what's going on with tax reform. And part of that credential is grounded in his work recently in the Obama administration at the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Tax Analysis, where he was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Tax Analysis. And I give special bonus points to Adam because in his time there, he oversaw the U.S. Treasury Department's first official report on the analysis and implementation of a carbon tax in the United States. I think that was a landmark report, and I highly recommend it. Last time I checked, it was still available online on the Treasury Department website. So some good analysis still persists, so avail yourself of that. So thank you, Adam, for your service. Prior to going to Treasury, he was back here at Brookings at our Hamilton project, where he was, basically running stuff as far as I can recollect. Okay, so that's Adam. And the second speaker will be Jerry Taylor, to my right here. Jerry is the president and founder of the Niskanen Center. I think it would be fair to call Niskanen Center, in just its 3 years of existence, by far the leading libertarian, politically savvy organization in this town.
That's fair.
Yeah, I think so. Jerry left Cato Institute to found Niskanen, and he can speak to his own journey about that. If you've never read his piece, The Conservative Case for a Carbon Tax, I highly recommend it. I think it's required reading for conservatives, people who view themselves as conservative or libertarian, in helping shape their thinking about climate policy. I guess I would think of Jerry in that regard as kind of a modern applied philosopher, because that piece is so compelling and scholarly and thoughtful. And then, speaking of writers, we have Amy Harder, who joins us from Axios. Amy's been covering the energy and climate beat for a while, and she joined Axios from the Wall Street Journal, where she covered similar issues, and she can kind of give you the sort of objective perspective from a journalist who's watched this for some time. So, Adam, let's start with you. What thoughts would you like to share about our topic today?
Sure. Well, I thought I'd start with a brief overview of what tax reform is doing and how a carbon tax might relate to it. Candidly, I think that carbon tax is a bit of a dark horse to be included in this round of tax reform. But it also seems like this is not going to be the last word on tax reform. There will be a lot of changes yet to come in the tax system, and the carbon tax will always be right there on the shelf, ready for the right moment. And so what I mean is that this round of tax reform, it's obviously very politically controversial. It includes a lot of elements that are controversial and unpopular. It's widely viewed as benefiting the wealthy and the well-connected. So, for instance, I think the Tax Policy Center estimates that in 2027, 90% of the gains of the Senate plan will accrue to taxpayers in the top 20%. 50% will accrue to taxpayers in the top 1%. And so what that means is that not only will it be hard to pass now, but I think it'll be popular, unpopular for years to come. It'll be a politically unstable in the sense that I think it'll be an element of elections yet to come about undoing unpopular elements of the Trump tax cuts. And even beyond that political risk, there's the reality that in order to pass this bill, large elements of it will have to be temporary. It'll have to expire to meet with the reconciliation rules. So what that means is that whatever legislation is enacted now, if it isn't enacted, it will be unpredictable, it will not be persistent, it will likely need to be revised in the near term. And beyond just the political issues, I would say it adds $1.5 trillion to the deficit over the next 10 years, leaves the debt to GDP ratio at 100% of GDP at the end of 10 years. And so it's also fiscally unsustainable. And for that reason, any expansion in fiscal expansion that occurs because of the tax bill is likely to need to be reversed in short order. And I expect that taxes are going to be part of the solution to that problem. Growth is not going to help them. The plan is not really a pro-growth tax plan. It doesn't. Its cuts are not primarily targeted on those elements that increase labor supply, increase investment, or even increase consumption in the near term. And furthermore, I think that with the economy near full employment, it's unlikely that the Federal Reserve is going to allow much of an expansion over the next several years. And so what that means is that we're going to, if this becomes law, we're going to need to make changes in tax law to address some of those problems. And even beyond the tax code, it's also not going to be an era of stability in our regulatory systems. Obviously, we're going to undergo a large number of regulatory changes. I'm sure those are going to be highly litigated over the next several years. And then there's the longer-term prospect of having administrations changes in administration leading to wide swings in regulatory policy, which can't be good from an economic perspective in terms of the stability and ability to plan for businesses and consumers. And so I don't necessarily think that the most likely solution will be the carbon tax, but it certainly will be right there on the shelf, ready to go when people want to get serious about solving some of these problems. The report that Adele alluded to earlier suggested that implementing a carbon tax not legislatively, but practically, would be relatively straightforward. That paper, for instance, suggested that the tax could be readily collected using basically the same administrative systems we have in place, in some cases using exactly the same forms that are used to collect existing excise taxes on fuels with some modifications. That paper estimated that the tax would be capable of raising a substantial amount of revenue. So, for instance, that paper pegged the rate, just as an example, at $49 a ton, increasing by 2% in real terms per year. It raised between $200 and $300 billion a year over the window under those assumptions. So a source of substantial revenue. It also analyzed the distributional consequences of that tax and suggested that the tax is not regressive in the way that I think many feared it would be. I think that was a surprising finding, but it basically arises from the fact that many tax and transfer systems are already indexed to inflation, so that any cost to the consumer of the carbon price would be in part offset, particularly for those that rely on transfers and elements of the tax system like the EITC and child tax credit, EITC that is indexed for inflation. And then it also gave a couple examples of how you could recycle the revenue. The paper gave some stylized examples, but in one of them was a simple rebate where consumers got back a check for $600 a year, basically, per person, to make sure that the tax was revenue neutral. And so that paper was very focused on the carbon tax per se. Specifically, one imagines if one were to implement a policy like that, you'd want to make substantial other changes, both to the tax system and to the regulatory system. We have something like $11 billion a year of energy-related tax expenditures, both to promote the use of fossil fuels, which would obviously work against the purpose of a carbon tax, but also to promote clean energy. The carbon price would supersede the need for many of those tax expenditures. Similarly, on the regulatory side, a carbon price would supersede the need to have a lot of the energy and environmental related regulations. And so those could be removed, eliminated, or reduced if you implemented a carbon tax. So even if the time's not right now, it will always be available and would be a reasonable way to solve a lot of these different problems.
Great. Thank you, Adam. And I appreciate that as the resident shelf keeper here at Brookings for policy ideas like that. So we are, I'm keeping them dusted off and ready to go when the time is right. Jerry, let's hear your thoughts.
Well, at the Niskanen Center, we talk primarily, though not entirely, to Republicans in the climate arena, and there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, we speak their language. I took Russian when I was in college. That's a joke, actually. I did take Russian in college. I just don't remember very much of it. But coming from the Cato Institute, and much of my staff likewise came from Cato or Heritage or Mercatus or the Charles Koch Institute, places like that, as apostate as we may be on certain matters like climate, we're people who have been of the right, from the right, with relationships in the Republican Party. So it's natural that we talk to them. But the most important reason we talk to them is it's virtually impossible to imagine meaningful climate action occurring without some substantial degree of Republican support. Now, I know that oftentimes it's easy to think about total victory scenarios, massive waves where Democrats take the House and Senate with veto-proof majorities, hold all three branches, and then ram their agenda through. But these are once-in-a-lifetime events. There was a tremendous study done by political scientist James Curry and Francis Lee, who's at the University of Maryland, released earlier this year, in which they looked at every significant policy change since the end of World War II. Actually, I think it was 1973 is when they began their analysis, through 2017. What they found is on only 10 occasions, was keystone legislation passed without the majority support of the minority party. 10 times in 44 years, or about 5% of the time. That means that trying to move meaningful climate policy without a lot of Republican support is waiting for a lottery ticket to come in. It can come in. Every once in a grand while, something like that can happen. But unless you're in the lottery ticket business, you're going to need to find Republican support. And that's what we try to do. Now, I'll spend the last few minutes I have here telling you a little bit about what we know about Republicans and what we've learned trying to move this issue on the Hill. I'm sure it sounds like an impossibly heavy lift to you. But then again, as I said, it's a lift that has to be done or we're going to get nowhere, so we need to begin somewhere. In the House, there are 40 to 60 Republicans who are deeply uncomfortable with the party's present position of abject climate denial. And there's probably about a dozen Republicans in the Senate who feel likewise. But that doesn't necessarily translate into an army that's about to charge the Hill on climate tax. First, what we need to do is get their safety in numbers. So, you have to think about these Republicans as if they're locked down in a denialist penitentiary. They want out, but they got to break out first. And if they're going to break out, first of all, they need their safety in numbers. If they just run to the fence episodically, one guy after the other, they're all going to be gunned down by the guards. They have to move together. Now, we're seeing some progress on that. The Climate Solutions Caucus in the House, for instance, has been steadily increasing its numbers, including even people like Darrell Issa and other Republicans who, up until this point, had not been scared unto death to find some way to separate themselves from the National Republican Party in their highly competitive districts. So we are starting to see some numbers coalesce. But we also need windows of opportunity. If we're going to make a break out of this prison cell, we're going to need a window of opportunity where the guards are distracted. And there may be a window of opportunity on tax reform and with infrastructure spending coming up. In fact, there will be some degree of an opening here. But I'm not entirely sure we're going to be able to take a great deal of advantage of it, because the third prerequisite you need is an escape car. And while if you're going to bust out, you need to be pretty comfortable about where you're going to go and what your plans are out. I like Congressman Larson's bill. I think that's wonderful. But right now, of the 40 to 60 House Republicans and a dozen or so in the Senate who are looking for a way out, they're not quite there yet. They know we need to do something, but that something doesn't have to be a carbon tax. That something could be, say, subsidizing conservative clean energy, as if energy had ideological atoms within it, but apparently it does. But that's a possibility, maybe just a lot of R&D. That's another possibility Republicans have in front of them. There are a couple of other things as well. I can say that thanks to the work that we've been doing on the Hill, along with other organizations that have been trying to promote a carbon tax, I would say that pricing carbon has the pole position within the GOP caucus. There's reasons for that. It gets right down to core identity issues. Milton Friedman argued if you have a pollution issue, the most efficient way of addressing it is just to tax pollution and then let market signals guide individual entrepreneurs and consumers to decide when, where, and how to reduce emissions rather than going to regulators. That speaks to Republicans. It goes all the way back to Milton Friedman. Most every academic right of center economists embraced as that position in the United States. And we now know that there's been a change in the oil and gas industry where all the majors, for the most part now, are either explicitly or implicitly in favor of carbon pricing. So if it's good enough for ExxonMobil, it's probably good enough for the GOP. And in fact, to give you an idea how well it speaks, last year during a police operation undertaken in the House to nip in the bud the conversations we've been having, was called the Scalise Resolution, which was trying to put a vote to the carbon tax before our friends were ready to make a fight out of it. Consider it like a lockdown and search of the prison cell. After that vote, Politico asked Senator James Inhofe, who's one of the most outspoken climate skeptics in the GOP, whether if that resolution were on the Senate side, if he'd vote for it. Now, of course, it was a little bit of a silly question. He actually did co-sponsor the exact same wording in the Senate that never came to a vote, so he was already on record as supporting it. But that's not what he told the Politico reporter. He said, I wouldn't rule it out. He said, it really depends on what's part of the deal here. I mean, if we're going to have a carbon tax, but we see some degree of regulatory relief as part of the trade, and if it were revenue neutral, I could imagine scenarios where this would be a conversation worth having. And this isn't the first time that he said this publicly or privately, as those of you who worked on the Hill know. So if James Inhofe will not rule out the idea on its face and is interested in the details and the terms and the conditions and whatnot, it tells you that this is a potentially fertile arena. To wrap it up, we'll go to Amy. I'm not necessarily particularly optimistic that we'll be ready to exploit opportunities for the very reasons I mentioned in the near future. But I think in the long haul, I'm fairly optimistic, and it's easy to lose sight of how difficult it is to enact major change in Congress. But it takes long, constant, steady work. And right now, what's clear is that we have the people in the GOP, at least for now, who have yet to succumb to climate denialism. They want a way out. There's a political roadmap for them out. The numbers are beginning to look better and better for some sort of a jailbreak. But if we keep at it, then I think down the road you can see a lot quicker change than you would have ever thought possible. Who would have ever thought in 1989 the tobacco industry was about to be completely upended, for instance, looking how strong that lobby was only a few years before the tobacco settlement. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. Jerry, now we turn to you, Amy.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. It's good to be here. I have a question for the audience to start out with. Raise your hands if you've seen the movie Secret Life of Pets. It's a great movie. I recommend you watch it, especially if you have kids. But there's a scene in there that I think of when I think of a carbon tax. And there's these two dogs, and they're running away from an angry pack of dogs, and they're in the sewage system of New York City, and they reach a dead end, and things seem really dire. And one dog says, we've got a problem. And the other dog says, we have so many problems. What problem do you mean in this moment? And that could be a scene for a lot of things in this world right now. But on a carbon tax, I kind of see that being the case here. There's a lot of problems with the carbon tax. Not to be the skunk in the room, but I suppose that's my job as a journalist. And Jerry got to some of them about the basic resistance within the Republican Party to publicly talk about climate change. Now, in private conversations with Jerry is one thing, but to reporters like me, the Republicans who are currently elected do not feel comfortable about talking about climate change. Most of them, I should say. To say nothing about supporting a carbon tax. So I don't think it's impossible to support a carbon tax without acknowledging climate change is a problem, but I do think it's certainly more intellectually honest. And Jerry and I were talking about that before we came up here, that it seems crazy on its face to impose a tax on something where you don't think there's a problem. So I think that's, frankly, the most inherent problem. And then the other one is that taxes are toxic, and carbon is also toxic from a political perspective and also from a climate change perspective. Let's not forget that Hillary Clinton also did not support a carbon tax. And you know that anecdote that Jerry shared about Senator Inhofe was under the really big assumption that most of us thought was going to happen, which is that Hillary Clinton would win. Which brings me to my third problem with a carbon tax, which is what to do with the EPA regulations. Under a Clinton presidency, the EPA would have gone into overdrive with its carbon agenda. Now with Trump, the industry broadly speaking, those regulations are going away, so there's no longer a stick to get people to the table. And do you preempt just the Clean Power Plan, although it's gone away, so it's sort of a moot question. But where you draw that line in terms of preempting EPA regulations is a very complicated question, and I know that's a topic that Republicans talk about a lot. Where ExxonMobil draws that line is very different from where environmental groups would even consider drawing that line. So I think that's an important problem. The concern, however real or not, that it's a regressive tax, is also a problem, and that gets me to the last problem I have here, which is how to spend the money. I'm from Washington State, so I'm always interested in policies that happen there, and I think many of us are probably familiar with the ballot initiative that failed in Washington, in part because environmentalists could not get on the same page, or just backers of the policy in general could not get on the same page with how to spend the money. And that remains a very live question. I just spoke with Governor Inslee, the governor of Washington, in Bonn, Germany, at the climate talks. And he remains of the mind that the money should be spent on a host of environmental and public health concerns. Well, that may not get the support you need from some in industry to get it over the finish line. So I think those are all the problems facing a carbon tax in my perspective. I think the first two, the fact that Republicans don't acknowledge climate change publicly anyway, that it's a problem in need of being addressed, and that taxes remain so toxic. I think those are the two biggest ones. I have asked some of my conservative and Republican sources which they would prefer as part of tax reform, a border adjustment tax, which of course seems to be out of the debate entirely, or a carbon tax. I don't get a good answer. I mean, that's kind of, to a lot of Republicans, is kind of like asking how you want to die. So the answer to them is neither. And you move forward with no big revenue raiser, as the congressman has talked about. And to Jerry's point about that House resolution that passed in June 2016, that got universal Republican support in the House, and a handful of Democrats. Now, a resolution is just symbolic, but symbolism matters a lot in politics, and so I think it shows how politically toxic it is. But that said, after all my skunk talk, I do have some sense that there might be a remote possibility that something like a carbon tax could pass, maybe in the next 3 to 5 years. Definitely not in the next month, although I would be surprised to be proven otherwise. It makes me remember the 2015 budget deal, which many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. In addition to funding the government, it also lifted the oil export ban that was in place for 40 years, and it extended for 5 years the production tax credit and investment tax credits for solar and wind. Now, that kind of came out of nowhere. The oil export ban had been in place, like I said, for 40 years. But the beauty of that deal was that it was a classic Washington bargaining deal, and both sides came out of it with exactly what they wanted. Republicans talked about how great it was that their oil company constituents can now export oil, and the Democrats talked about how important the wind and solar tax credits were for combating climate change. Now, obviously, the debate around climate change is a little bit different in a carbon tax, but to the degree that something could happen, I don't ever imagine, Senator McConnell coming out and praising the merits of a carbon tax. However the deal would come out, it would be in a way that both sides get something they really want. Now, again, because Trump won and not Hillary Clinton, the allure of getting rid of EPA regulations is now mostly gone, although we could argue about the legal requirements of having an EPA regulation. So I bring up the oil export and tax credit deal as just an example of the way things can get done in Washington that can have surprising big policy results, and in a way that both sides get a little bit of something they want.
Great, thank you, Amy. So Amy, I wanted to ask you about what you thought about Adam's point that if the Senate goes forward with this current tax bill, more or less in the shape of what the House contemplated, and it greatly increases the federal deficit and becomes unsustainable politically once down the road folks fully come to grips with the implications of that law. How does that change perhaps the dynamics of what you were talking about? Is there some potential instability associated with passing tax reform that could then redound to the potential for a new dynamic along the deal-making lines you just described?
Yeah, I don't think, the fact that there'll be a greater deficit will prompt Congress to act. It certainly hasn't in the past. But what I do think is different, and what so far is lacking in the carbon tax debate, is a lot of industry pushing for it. Jerry mentioned that most major oil and gas companies support a carbon tax and or have an internal price on carbon, which is certainly true. But it's very different to have a press release that says, such as what ExxonMobil says, I support a carbon tax, versus going to Congress and asking for one and lobbying for one. With the oil export ban deal and the IT and the wind and solar tax credits, you had energy companies all across the spectrum asking Congress for this. The Kigali Amendment, not to get off on too far of a tangent, but you have some chemical companies, Honeywell, Chemours, they want this deal on the HFCs to go through because they have dollars on the line. So I think what would change the game is if industry gets on board and actually starts asking for this. So far, they support it when asked, but to my knowledge, I would love to know otherwise, there's not an aggressive effort by industry to get anything like a carbon tax.
That's a really interesting point, Amy. I've actually heard from some corporate stakeholders a concern about talking about a carbon tax and tax reform because they have so many other priorities in the tax reform package, and you have a limited ability to lobby across a complex piece of legislation like this. And so maybe if we got tax reform out of the way, whether it's sustainable or not, then industry could come back to the prospects of EPA regulation in a future Democratic regime, or the proliferation of state and local regulations, which we know is probably the default if there's not federal leadership. Jerry, what are you hearing in your conversations with Republicans about the role of industry, or with industry representatives themselves?
Well, Amy's right. The only business entities that are trying to rattle cages on Capitol Hill on a carbon tax are those that aren't in the energy business. They're like Google or Elon Musk or people like that. And not to say they don't count in Republican circles, but they only count a very small amount relative to what the oil, gas, and coal industries count for in Republican circles when it comes to energy issues. I'm not trying to make some argument that they're in the thrall of API or anything of the kind, but the reality is that the oil, gas, and coal industry in this particular debate on a carbon tax has a lot more influence than, say, people out of Silicon Valley. But no, outside of that small segment of the business community, they're not acting. And when you talk to people in the business community about why that is, they just say, look, man, I don't see an opening here for us, and I don't want to spend my company's political capital trying to move something that isn't going to go anywhere, and I need these guys on this, and this. If things change, maybe. So, but what I have heard, and more than from one source, is that if a debate were to get traction for a carbon tax, if a bill were introduced and it actually began to look like it was a mover, then at that point, the industry may jump in and start investing some resources. But if we're waiting for them to do all the initial blocking and tackling to open up a hole so that some Republicans can exploit that hole, we'll be waiting pretty much forever. I don't think that's going to happen.
Adam, anything you'd like to chime in on this discussion so far?
I mean, so I think I agree broadly with a lot of the concerns raised. I mean, I'm used to the economist being the skunk in the room, not
I know.
the journalist.
I was thinking that too.
So
I thought that was our job.
I know. So yeah, exactly our job. But I would say that the deficit has been to some extent a driver of policy compromises in the past, and over the last 8 years, for instance, there have been substantial declines in the deficit that were the result of sometimes uncomfortable compromises where there was sequestration and there were the expiration of certain tax cuts and other tax increases. So you end up with we're going to have to do something, and over the next several years, that is going to involve tough fiscal choices and involve revenues. So that's really where I'm coming from on that. I won't say that carbon tax is like the obvious solution to that politically, but I'm saying that they're going to need to make changes.
Very good. So why don't we open it up to questions from the audience? Rafe. Oh, wait for the mic, though.
Should I?
Yeah, you can stand if you want.
I'm Rafe Pomerantz. With a group called Arctic 21. I'm enjoying the metaphor description of how Republicans move, which is breaking out of the prison yard. Will stick with me. I thought Amy offered one way out, which is a deal that everybody has something that's big enough for them to brag about. But I wanted to offer one other poster for that breakout, which is impacts. And I'll give you a location. The most important political state in the country is Florida. Sea level rise is an existential threat. It's now visible, having impacts, and the forecasts are out there. In fact, in 2 weeks, there's a gathering of 600 government officials, mostly in Fort Lauderdale. So, question. In other words, the issue is, can impacts trump the ideological problem inside the Republican Party? And in Florida, there's some evidence for that in the climate caucus, where you have Floridian members, Republicans, as part of leadership. So I'm asking the question, if the impacts are defined well enough, can they be a cover? Because if Lindsey Graham has to get cover, he said, well, to his fellow Republicans, I can't let Charleston go. This is more important to me than your ideological problems.
Yeah, it's a good question. What we know is, up to this point, there has been zero evidence that extreme weather and climate events has moved Republican opinion on climate. Robert Burrell, who is I think he's a sociologist, has co-authored a number of different studies on this using regression analyses to try to explain movements in public opinion, particularly on the Republican side. No evidence whatsoever extreme weather events have done that up to this point. That doesn't mean that won't be the case, that won't change in the future. But various hurricanes and wildfires and whatnot has had no effect so far. Now, you do see a number of Republicans in coastal areas in the Atlantic, not only in Florida, but in South Carolina and elsewhere, including people like Mark Sanford, who's a Freedom Caucus member who's spoken out on climate change upon occasion, and I've met with him. He's genuinely concerned about it, and he would like the federal government to do something. I'm not entirely sure, however, how much further that movement can go given the members in their existing districts. I mean, I just don't know. So there is some reason for hope, but up to this point, it has had very limited impact. The biggest problem we have, however, is that if you envision climate impacts that are significantly larger than anything we've seen up to this point, then moving Republican opinion, it's probably too late. The reality is the climate budget is not infinite. It's dwindling. And if we don't begin to act in the next few years in a very aggressive and ambitious fashion, then action is always better than non-action, and late is better than never. but the reality is waiting for Book of Revelations sort of scenarios from climate catastrophe to then move to Congress means, little.
I think that if Congress doesn't act on gun control after all of the shootings we've had, I think it's very, very unlikely that it will ever act on climate change because of extreme weather. There was bipartisan support to issue, tougher regulations on bump stocks. I think that's what they're called. After the Vegas shooting, that never happened. So I often think about this question, and I compare it to things like shootings and gun control and gay marriage and these other issues. And on gay marriage, there were some politicians who were impacted by it directly when they had a son or a daughter or a close friend who wanted to get married, and that was, I think that helped move the needle here in Washington. But we're not seeing it all on gun control, despite the increase in shootings. And climate change is so much more abstract than both of those issues. I have written extensively on the link between climate change and extreme weather, but it's still, relatively speaking, especially in political terms, it's a slow-moving train wreck. Where I do think there could be increased support is more policies to adapt to climate change. I would see that happening as these extreme weather events get more common.
If I can, just for a second on that, because the gun issue is a very interesting one. If you look at opinions or surveys, you'll find that there are more Republicans who are concerned about climate change than there are Republicans who support gun control. That's the first thing that's kind of interesting. The reality is that the NRA position on guns is one of the most unpopular set of opinions in American politics. It really is. I'm not exaggerating. Their various issue positions poll usually in the teens at best. Yet they still have a lot of political power. Why? Because it's a very high salience issue for their members. They have people in the NRA who would walk over hot coals to punish a politician who deviated on that particular issue. It's not the same thing in the climate arena. People who are climate skeptics in the GOP have about 30 other things they care way more about than climate change. The fact that climate change is low salience is usually a problem for people like me who would like to see more ambitious action. But in a sense, it's also kind of a somewhat disguised helping factor as well, because it means that the Republicans can move on climate and probably not pay the same kind of price they'd have to pay if they moved on, say, gun control, because there is not an army of people outside of Myron and Bell's immediate family at CEI who would walk over hot coals to punish a politician who ever thought about trying to make a run out of that denialist penitentiary.
So, Rafe, you had a follow-up. I'm going to give you a small follow-up in the form of a question. And can we have the mic back? Real brief. Real short.
In the climate world, there's a real distinction at this stage between extreme weather and sea level rise. Sea level rise is inexorable. It's understandable. It's different than the probabilities of whether an event is climate related.
I'm not hearing a question.
Okay. Will property values trump the NRA? That is to say, property values in Florida are at stake. Is that something that Republicans care enough about?
I've actually talked to people about this issue, and I think you might be onto something. I think it's just a matter of time before investors start shorting property in Miami, and that really shows up in a very concrete, tangible way in the economies of vulnerable areas. And so that, I think, can get attention. I mean, far be it from me to analyze the Republican caucus from Florida, but I can only imagine that when real estate prices start coming to play, that does get attention, and people start asking, why aren't you doing something about that? How?
It would appear obvious that our terrific panelists here are rather pessimistic about anything happening in the foreseeable future on carbon tax or pricing carbon in any other way, at least in the United States of America. But I don't know what the latest figures are. I think the U.S. represents, 15% or something of total global emissions of CO2. And if in 5 or 10 years things are more propitious to maybe do something about this, like a tax, and I were a senator or a congressman, why would I vote in favor of it if all the other major nations are not doing the same thing in unison? And what would you do about that?
Yeah, well, you were in Bonn recently, Amy. Tell me about your perception of the dynamics and how seriously other countries really are grappling with the problem. We know there's a disconnect between the Paris Accord commitments and the actual policies that countries have undertaken, not to mention the disconnect between the Paris Accord commitments and the 2 degrees centigrade and below consensus of the parties to the conference. So what's your perspective?
Yeah, I was in Bonn for about a week and also in Morocco for the climate talks that started literally the same week that President Trump won the election. But your question was interesting to me because the way you phrased it shows just how much things have changed over the last year or more. President Obama made climate change a big part of his second term priority and his legacy. And, his argument and those in his administration emphasized that the U.S. needs to lead. Otherwise, the biggest emitting nations like China and India will not get on board if the U.S. is not leading. So now the U.S. led and helped strike the Paris deal in the end of 2015. And then Trump won. And, my sole job at the talks in Marrakesh, Morocco, was to ask as many negotiators as I could find what they thought about Trump's promise to pull out of the Paris deal. At the time, people were skeptical. He actually meant that. In hindsight, it has ended up being one of the few things, his few campaign promises that he has kept to. And so I think now you have a reverse, and your question shows how much things have flipped on its head. You have China and India and other countries, at least for now, moving ahead with their commitments, regardless of what the U.S. is doing. I think China's doing it. China's, further ahead than, say, India in its development in this area, and they're doing it largely for geopolitical reasons. Their air pollution is terrible, so they're doing it for their own reasons, and they see a strategic hole being left behind. Of course, it's nowhere near the same as the U.S. in terms of credibility. In terms of Adele's question on that point, I think for now it's not like there's any country that's plotting some sort of big attack on the U.S. for pulling out of the Paris deal for two reasons. One, because again, climate change is a low priority. There's lots of other issues. I just got a news alert before I got up here that North Korea fired another missile. So the world has a lot of problems. Climate change is just one of them. And so I think for now, the other countries are trying to work with the U.S. the best they can. I think the rubber is really going to hit the road at the talks in Poland next year, where some of the more tougher conversations about the Paris deal are going to come to the fore. But I think, just to specifically answer your question, I think it seems that the world is moving ahead. And so I don't think it's going to be the fact that the U.S. won't sign a carbon tax because the other countries haven't. I think they will move ahead. I just think it may not be quite as ambitious as it would have been with the U.S. in the lead.
And I would just say that my own view is one of the key advantages of a carbon tax over the regulatory approach that the Obama administration pursued is its diplomatic power. I mean, I think, President Obama said all the right things, but backing him up was a very flawed legal authority to control greenhouse gases. And we see one of those flaws in action right now, which is it's subject to the priorities of whoever's in the White House. And moreover, really try explaining Section 111D of the Clean Air Act to other countries and develop credibility and transparency about what it is you're doing when you've got a whole host of regulatory implementation and Supreme Court litigation processes to go through before you can even call it in effect. So I think everybody around the world knows what $40 per ton of CO2 means, and they know what $25 per ton. You put it in those terms, you can't get more transparent about the level of additional effort. And just, I really look forward to the day when we can leverage a policy that's that powerful diplomatically into analogous action, because I think they are waiting in some ways for action by the United States. And it's not till we're in there really making it an economic negotiation, not, with all the finance ministers talking, all the environment ministers talking about collective temperature targets, but really saying economically, what are we committing to doing here? That's when we know it's going to get serious, and I think a carbon tax would be extraordinarily powerful tool for the U.S. diplomatically. So I think that those who are worried about us taking unilateral action should fully comprehend the global ramifications of an action like that in the processes you saw in Bonn and through all the economic relationships we have. Okay, how about another question? We got time for maybe, let's gather 3 more, and then we'll let the panelists go for it. Yes.
Thank you, and thank you to the panel and to Representative Larson as well, and for the program today. I'm Jean Wright with the Faith Alliance for Climate Solutions in Fairfax County, and while I hear the pessimism on the federal level, it seems at the local and state level, there may be a little more optimism about acting, and there does seem to be quite a movement now of action on the local level and the city level and the state level that's being very much supported by Bloomberg. So in terms of a pollution tax, how do you see, or might you see, the possibility of that happening at the state levels in terms of infrastructure? Because at the local level is where the lack is felt the most. So what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, and 2 more. Yes, sir.
Birchall Wilson, I'm an economist. Straight out question for the economists on the panel. There will be net economic losses from a carbon tax. I'm just wondering where those land in terms of their distributional impact. And does that explain the political resistance to the implementation of a carbon tax?
Okay, good question. And in the back there in the yellow shirt.
In 2016, the Democratic Party in its national platform had 0 carbon by 2050. What price would you have to tax carbon at to get to 0 carbon by 2050? And how painful would the tax have to be to make me never get on an airplane, not live in the exurbs, and never take a vacation?
Okay, so we've got state and local action and the prospects for that, and it's significant. The net economic losses that might accrue from climate change, and the feasibility and economics associated with achieving 0 carbon by 2050. Anybody on the panel want to grab one of those?
I'll do a drive-by on 2, and I'll answer one more thoroughly. As far as whether the distributional impact of a carbon tax reduces its political salience, I can guarantee you the answer is no, because most people, 1 out of 1 million Americans, could tell you anything sensible about the distributional impact of a carbon tax, and probably only about 1/3 of them could even tell you what a carbon tax is. So that's not to say these are not issues politicians will care about and elected officials, but they are not matters that are of great political concern as far as the American public is concerned. I think it's probably safe to say that they, to whatever extent they've ever thought about an energy tax, probably don't like it because they don't want to pay more for energy. And that's pretty much all we've got on this conversation to begin with. Notice, however, it didn't stop John McCain from getting the Republican nomination in 2008, promising a cap and trade program and elimination of carbon, not quite by 2050, but pretty close. What would be the costs of that? There have been modeling. Adele can talk more about it. What she will tell you, I'm sure, because she's the modeling genius and not me, is that the error bars in those estimates are massive. It depends on how optimistic you are about low carbon energy and how competitive it is. If you're like, say, Michael Liebrecht, who is the head of Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and you're on the bleeding edge of optimism, you would say it wouldn't take a very ambitious carbon tax at all to get there. If you are more bearish, let's assume you work for Grover Norquist, then you would probably say it would take a massive carbon tax to get me to reduce even a little bit of my energy consumption. But I'll let Adele get into the numbers on that. And state and local, I wanted to dwell on this for a moment because I have little patience for the conversation. No offense. For a couple of reasons. One, state and local governments which have acted thus far on climate have acted anemically. You have a RGGI trading system that prices carbon at around $4 a ton. It's not very ambitious. California has a floor price of about 11 or so a ton, and it regularly bounces on that floor. Now that has been revised, and we'll see how the new program works out. But even in California, 80% of the emissions reductions that occur in that state haven't occurred because of pricing carbon. It's occurred because of the regulations. And if you look at the states that are looking forward towards the possibility of a carbon tax, what do you know? You find a couple of things. One, there's virtually no carbon in those states. It's an easy vote, right? Washington, Vermont, Maine, oh, come on. There aren't coal plants up there. Even in Washington State, it would have been a fairly minor lift. In Massachusetts, where they're looking at it, it doesn't even apply to the utility sector. It's just a gasoline tax. And if you look at what kind of emissions reductions you're going to get from these carbon pricing regimes, virtually none. I mean, and it's only blue states. Now, that doesn't mean to minimize it. There are a lot of, blue states we want to be worried about. And 30% of the U.S. economy does have a carbon price on it from state action. But the reality is it's never in the place where the carbon emissions really are, which is Virginia, Ohio, Texas, places like that. So, yeah, I'll be pretty blown away if a red or a purple state could put a carbon pricing regime on in an arena where we actually see significantly meaningful greenhouse gas emissions. But we've never seen that at the state level. What we see is virtue signaling from blue states which have very little downside to pricing carbon. And as long as that's the case, I'm not against virtue signaling. I do it enough myself sometimes. But it's by no means a substitute for federal action.
I just had a couple of thoughts, not to be more of a skunk than Jerry, but on the local efforts. So I spent a lot of time at the U.S. Climate Action Igloo at the Bonn Climate Talks that was funded by Tom Steyer and Michael Bloomberg. And they talked a lot about how they have this coalition that's 40% of the U.S. economy. The 40% of the U.S. economy, they would be the third largest country in the world if they were their own country. But they only represent 35% of U.S. emissions, only 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So just to underscore Jerry's point with some numbers, I would say that in light of Trump pulling out of the Paris deal or signaling his intent to, the blue states are getting bluer and the red states are just kind of keeping their status quo. That's not to say there's not movement in some of these red states. Wyoming has a growing wind industry and things like that, but it won't be on the level of, say, a carbon tax. Although you do see an increase in the amount of states, both red and blue, that are passing gasoline taxes, which is an interesting aside. And to the gentleman's point about the zero carbon by 2050, I think just from a qualitative perspective, I think it's interesting what that represents, because there is a growing debate within the Democratic Party about whether or not to try to be 100% renewable and how aggressive to be. And that divide in the Democratic Party is a very real one. And I think you've seen it play out a little bit in the carbon tax debate, as we saw in Washington State.
Adam, some last thoughts?
So I think on the state issue, the appropriate level the appropriate government entity to levy the tax is probably the federal level or the world level, not the state level. I think for all the reasons that have been articulated. On the burden of the tax, I think people do see it as it would be a tax increase, and people would see it in the price of the goods that they consumed. There are ways to mitigate that. But again, it's not. It is a tax increase. I would say more generally, in terms of economic activity, it would also be a tax increase from the perspective of its macroeconomic effects. So it would, other things equal, slow growth unless other distortionary taxes were eliminated or reduced. So I think those are headwinds in an economic sense in that regard. And what was the last question?
The zero carbon.
Oh, zero carbon. I will defer on that one.
Okay, so I get the last word. Privileges of the moderator here. So state and local, I applaud state and local governments, and I validate their frustration with the lack of leadership at the federal level. But I have to agree with Adam that the nature of this challenge has to be solved with high-level action by the federal government. And I'll just cite two reasons among many. One is we need to harness American capital markets with price signals. And to do that, you need the whole of the American economy deployed to develop that technology. Look, we're going to be the crucible. If we do this right, the U.S. will be the crucible in which the technology that can be applied globally, affordably, will be forged. And without us, at scale working on this problem, I don't think we're going to have the technologies that achieve like a deep decarbonization scenario of any kind by any date. And similarly, state and local governments don't have the standing internationally. God love Jerry Brown, but he's not a party to the COP, right? So, you can go there and he can use his platform, but without someone sitting in the chair with United States in front of them, it's a severely handicapped diplomatic approach. With regard to the net economic losses, so people talk about that with regard to carbon tax, but you really got to compare it to the alternative. And there are two alternatives. One is a regulatory approach, which I think most economists would agree would be far less efficient, more costly, less effective, and have its own distributional consequences. And unchecked climate change will have potentially devastating distributional consequences. So I think that, if a well-designed price on carbon can be included in a pro-growth fiscal package, that's probably about as good as we're going to do. And I think the research that we and my colleagues around the analytical community have been developing can demonstrate that. And as far as zero carbon goes, I'm a little bit sympathetic to your question. I'd probably have a different tone with it, but I get what you're saying is like if you just kind of say make up a target and a date, and you're not really grappling with, well, what is the policy you're going to use to get there? What technologies do we have to get there? Then it's it's sort of a political exercise, but it's not really a genuine policy formation and a serious consideration of the options and their various pros and cons. And so I tend to appreciate objectives that are tangible, measurable, transparent in their economic and environmental ambition. And so if I'm developing the platform and nobody's asking me, I kind of like more concrete goals. Yes, you have your aspirational statements, but you want to translate that into something that kind of meets Representative Larson's pragmatic test as well. So I'm going to conclude with that. Please join me in thanking our panel. Thank you for being here.